Hello and welcome into the KE Report. I'm your host, Shad Markowitz, and today we're getting an update on Stillwater Critical Minerals, traded on the TSX.V under the ticker PGE, and on the OTCQB under the ticker PGEZF. And we're joined today with the president and CEO of Stillwater Critical Minerals, Michael Rowley. And Mike, it's great to get you back on the show to get an update. The last time we talked in late May, we were discussing the initial batch of drill results that you'd put out at the Stillwater West Project. But now we've got 6 more holes that were released a couple weeks ago to dig into here. And all 6 holes hit mineralization, a little over 2,000 meters. What can you tell us about how these next 6 holes from last year's drill program figure into the overall picture and the continuity of this deposit?
Oh, sure. I'd be glad to. And glad to be back, by the way. Good to be back in touch. Yeah, all 6 holes hit mineralization, and more to the point, we continue to hit nice high grade within mid grade, within bulk tonnage grade, meters within tens of meters, within hundreds of meters. And that reflects what a large system this is and how well mineralized it is. And in this day and age of commodity prices, nickel sitting where it's sitting as our main commodity, it's very important to have that optionality on mine model, because the bigger, lower grade projects not always feasible at these prices. And this is one of the things that Glencore is really liking about us. I can pleased to report that the technical committee meetings have been excellent with them, and they like that optionality on grade and also the polymetallic nature of this project, because as we like to say, it's internally hedged. You're not married to any one commodity. So we're very pleased with the results, both the optionality on grade and also the polymetallic nature of it. And I would speculate that we have indeed driven a resource update, a larger and higher grade resource update like we'd hoped to.
Well, Mike, when do you think you'll have a resource out? Would it be just on this 2023 drilling, or are you going to look at doing some additional drilling in 2024 before you update the resource again?
That's this discussion internally, but I think a resource update may well be due in the coming months here, based on what we're seeing. You've seen from the news release the encouraging results, how that sits with the existing resources, and then we also put a teaser out with the 3D geology model on the Chrome Mountain area. We've done similar work 9 kilometers away at the Iron Mountain area, and also at CZ in between, and all of that will drive that resource expansion effort.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about the polymetallic nature of the deposit, which I think we do almost every time we talk, Mike, but I think it's important to drive home that, yes, it's a nickel forward deposit, but there's quite a bit of copper sulphide here. You've got the gold, you've got platinum, you've got palladium, you've got rhodium, and historically, people weren't really assaying for some of those other things. Only recently have you guys started assaying for rhodium, for example. But there's just a polymetallic mix here of different minerals. You've got cobalt in there, which is a strategic metal for the U.S. government and has been in the past. How does that all tie together into the bigger value proposition of this deposit? Because as you say, there's high grade within mid grade within low grade, but it's also the polymetallic nature that's so attractive to both governments and larger companies.
That's exactly right. And Glencore is on board, and so is the DoD in the U.S. I mean, they've told us that they want a U.S. supply chain. We have 9 of their minerals listed as critical. We asked which ones do you want us to focus on, if any, and they've basically said nickel and cobalt for us. So we can certainly deliver on that count. As you mentioned, we've got over 1 billion pounds of nickel right beside producing mines in the U.S. We are the biggest nickel resource in an active U.S. mining district, full stop, and that has to be of interest. Mines are even well liked where we are, thanks to the good work by Sibanye, our neighbor. Cobalt, also very real. We got 91 million pounds. And you mentioned copper. We have 500 million pounds of copper in a producing U.S. district. Copper's a darling right now, so is gold, and we have that in a co-product capacity. In a word, it's Platreef, right? It's what Anglo-American has been mining at Mahalaquena since 1993. It's a big copper nickel sulphide deposit with PGEs, very profitable and very large. Mahalaquena is 15 billion pounds of nickel and copper as sulfides and 152 million ounces of PGEs and gold. Right next door to that is Ivanhoe's Platreef mine, the baby with only 8 billion pounds. of nickel and copper, and I think 95 million ounces of PGE and gold. The scale of these things is staggering, and that's exactly what we have in Montana. It is Platreef in Montana, and of course, we took Ivanhoe's chief geologist as our vice president exploration, Dr. Danny Grobler. Really pleased to bring that connection to Montana. That's what we're proving up, and that's where the polymetallic mix that you mentioned comes from. It's just a property of these magmas in these kinds of systems. Platreef is just stratigraphically next to the mighty Marinsky Reef and UG2 mines. The parallel in Montana is the JM Reef deposit that's being mined by my neighbor, Sibanye, and we're just adjacent to that. It really isn't rocket science.
Well, Mike, I'm going to push back on it's not rocket science, because after I talked to Danny Grobler at the VRIC earlier this year, I felt like I had to be a rocket scientist to understand how complex some of the mineralization was, in the sense that you said in one word it's Platreef, but yet in the press release you mentioned there's actually 3 mineralization styles. There is the Platreef style, the nickel, PGE, copper, or cobalt, but there's also the nickel sulphide rich N series, those new N series that we've discussed before, and then there's the stratiform reef type, the PGE nickel copper chromite mineralization. So you actually have a couple different mineralized events going on all at the same time here. Maybe just speak to that while there is the Platreef style for sure, there's also these other mineralized events happening in tandem.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've done your homework. I appreciate that. The joke internally is that they call it the Bushveld complex for a reason, and they call it the Stillwater complex for a reason. It isn't homogeneous, and that's a really good thing, because some of these other large-scale nickel deposits are simply homogeneous, and you get the same recovery and the same grade everywhere. And that's good in one market, but it's not always good in all markets. Stillwater Igneous Complex is indeed complex, and as you mentioned, there were successive pulses of magma at different times. Timing here is all within millions of years. It's all laid down 2.7 billion years ago. Bushveld was laid down, I think, 2.1 billion years ago. But in that time, it was kept hot for a period of maybe 10 million years. And you've got these successive pulses coming in, and that's the deep feeder target that you see talked about in some of my presentations. And that fits with the disruption of the layering that we see at Chrome Mountain in particular, where some of those discrete chrome layers don't make sense anymore. They're obliterated, they're gone. That reflects those successive pulses of magma, new metal coming in. So I'm glad you had time with Danny, because he's better able to relate that than I am.
Well, and I think that the N series, which we've talked about a little bit before, would be worth reiterating. It's one of those other pulses, and they're kind of running a little different than the Platreef style deposit. Maybe just speak to how those are just adding to not just the complexity, but the metal traps that you see and more fluids coming into the system.
Absolutely. And the N series are exciting to us because they've never been recognized at Stillwater before, and they don't exist in the Bushveld. So they're unique here. You're absolutely right. They're upgrading. They have an upgrading effect wherever they meet the bigger bodies of mineralization that we're already targeting. 4 or even 5 of the holes that we just released were targeting those N series, and you see that in the news release. We also targeted some EM anomalies as well and had success there with the other holes. And that's further to additional hits in previous years where we first started to recognize these N structures and what they meant. You're absolutely correct that they probably tie into that deep root that we see under Chrome Mountain, and that's related in one of the slides in our deck.
Well, I think that's probably what has Glencore's interest in this project, is that they're seeing a complex system with multiple types of metals all tying together into a massive land package and scale of this deposit. And you have both the bulk tonnage and the mid-grade that is really what makes a project work, and then the high-grade zingers just to add a little icing on the cake. But speaking of Glencore, I think we should also mention that you just added a new member to your board of director, Glencore's Bradley Adamson. Maybe just speak to his background for people not familiar and why you're excited to have him on the board.
Absolutely. He's a welcome addition, and he is their vice president of business development for the nickel division. He's way up there. He's been at Glencore now for, I think, over 20 years. Started as a metallurgist and then got into the market side and the corporate side. Has worked on projects in Africa and worked on projects globally. We had a board dinner a few weeks ago, and it was just, I got to tell you, conversation was fascinating. Bradley, Nora, myself, Greg, and Gregor, and just great to get the team together and talk. Bradley's insight on metallurgy, mines, global metal markets, and as you know, their interest in this wonderfully underexplored and yet big and well mineralized Stillwater district is really interesting. And the fact they would put him on the board and write 2 checks to us in under a year says a lot. At a premium to market too. This is going the right direction, and we in Glencore and the Department of Defense U.S. government are aligned on building a domestic supply chain for the U.S. for exactly the minerals that we have.
Well, Mike, with all the good work that your team has done year after year, I'm sure people listening in will want to know what's next. What are the next catalysts? How do you envision approaching the exploration moving forward? What are some of the next steps for the company?
Sure. Yeah, we've been active in the field. I know it doesn't look like it right now. We do our physical properties on last year's core, 6 different measurements that basically refine the model and give us greater accuracy. That's not very glamorous stuff. More glamorous, you'll see us do probably a large geophysical survey and then follow that up with drilling and the resource expansion effort. Bigger picture, you'll see us start to wrap some real PEA level thinking around this project because we're big enough now to start talking about a possible mine, right? We've got that 10 to 20 year sort of mine life. We want to work that in tandem with growing the project. We've got 5 deposits across 9 kilometers. They clearly want to connect and they want to grow. They're open in all directions and at depth. So we will continue to grow as well by the drill. Government funding, well underway. Watch for updates on that. And also watch for updates on non-core assets. We've been busy, and the junior mining space, I think, is coming back to life. I touch wood as I say that. It's been a brutal stretch, as you well know, but that creates value in the upside, and we are getting interest in our lesser assets as well. So we're busy, and there's lots of news to follow.
Well, Mike, just to that point, and just kind of as we wrap up, just big picture, I look at your resource size already before you even incorporate last year's drilling into it, and I'm just puzzled at the in situ value of these metals in the ground versus your market cap. And if I think about the 4 other projects you have in addition to Stillwater West that are getting 0 value, I'm just puzzled by the valuation that Stillwater Critical Minerals is receiving. Could you just walk people through what the in situ value of the metals you have already based on the resource in the ground, just as a benchmark? And then, just maybe speak to why do you think it is the market doesn't realize all the value you have, even in the other projects?
Sure. Yeah. The in situ value is something like 16 billion US dollars, even at current nickel prices. And yet the market cap is perhaps 28 million US. So the disparity there, is almost a 1,000-fold disparity. That's not uncommon in our sector right now. We've actually done better than a number of our peers. We're above our last placement price. We're still 2 to 3 times at least below where we should be, just based on what we have. And I think you could argue for much greater multiples too. We have 4 other assets. You're absolutely correct. We get very little acknowledgement of that. District scale gold position in Ontario that Heritage Mining, a new listing, HML here in Canada, is doing really good work to advance. And that's given us a 20-something% share position in them. I consider that project to be on its way and in good hands, and they're working on that earn-in. We still have the Kluane nickel copper PGE project in the Yukon, and you will see an announcement of a small work program there this year. Duke Island, Alaska is getting some increasing attention, another critical minerals project. And of course, we maintain the back-end right on the past producing Yankee Dundee mine in BC as well. That's in my financial statements. So we've been doing this a long time, and we work hard. The winds have not been with us for the entire sector. In fact, the commodity space in general is historically undervalued relative to big board stocks. And I see several corrections that will happen and several arguments to be made for the value case in what we're doing. First, in the broad commodity market. Second, in the mining space. And then thirdly, the junior miners, which are so beaten down and so forgotten. And we always come around. The price of gold leads the way. And with the price of gold making record highs every day right now, I think that's imminent, that we will see some real capital flows into the sector.
Well, Mike, I was going to wrap it up there, but another question just occurred to me. We talked about gold, doing better and coming back into its own and getting a little more life in the junior mining sector. But what about nickel? Because nickel's had some interesting fundamental catalysts. Top of mind is just BHP closing down some of their nickel operations, but it's gone through the hurt locker over the last year or so. But I would think that would be a big tailwind for the whole sector. What do you make of some of the battery metals companies and manufacturing companies and auto companies coming down into the nickel space versus retail investors snubbing their noses and ignoring it? Is there a value arbitrage here for investors to capitalize on?
Absolutely. The challenge is that the metal price itself does not recognize geopolitics. And China, especially regarding nickel markets, are squeezing out Western competitors. They will produce high carbon nickel and they will lose money doing it in Indonesia, which they are doing, and flood it on the market to keep the price down and do exactly what they're doing with BHP, driving out the Western competitors. Where is the IRA compatible nickel supply? We just lost a significant IRA compatible producer in those BHP Western Australia operations you mentioned. What's left? Sudbury, there's not enough. This is precisely why the DoD is so interested in us. With the largest nickel resource in an active U.S. mining district, it's something that could be turned on and mining, inside of a decade. And that's interesting to them. We've been approached by automakers. They acknowledge that they can't get their subsidies. Their consumers can't get the subsidies without the IRA compatible aspect. Where is that going to come from? The geopolitics have to be recognized. We also see that in rare earths, which is another element that was in the news recently, the games that China is playing there. And it's the same tactic to deliberately drive out Western producers and dominate global supply chains.
Well, it's definitely a story we'll keep following along with here at the KE Report as far as how the geopolitics shapes the global metal markets, but definitely some interesting catalysts in store for nickel. I don't think we need to reiterate all the catalysts that are already in place for things like copper and cobalt, but just a lot going on in the markets, and even platinum and palladium getting a little bit more of a boost recently because of thoughts on how many EVs actually will be scaled back in favor of hybrid vehicles, and hybrid vehicles still having the catalytic converters that need the platinum and palladium. So it's some interesting drivers for all the metals that you have in the ground there, Mike, and we'll keep following along with the news at Stillwater Critical Minerals. If people listening in want to follow along with the news, definitely click on the link below this interview. It takes you right over to the company website, right to the news section. Mike, keep us posted as more news comes out. We'll get you back on the show for an update, and looking forward to our next conversation.
You bet. Thanks, Chad. Cheers.